everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Deborah Roberts. I am the chair of the Select Board and the chair of the Stoughton Equal Opportunity Committee. Tonight is the first night of our two-day MLK event, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King event. It starts off with an Indigenous and African American tour right here at Town Hall. I have with me Betty Sabri.
Hi, my name is Betty Sabri, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Stoughton Equal Opportunity Committee. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight for this program. You will hear about Indigenous people in African American history, and we also look forward to you tuning in on Monday for our Martin Luther King event celebration.
My name is Dwight McCarran, head of the Stoughton Historical Society, and we are honored to be here tonight with some of our artifacts, such as this Charles Sumner desk, which came from the Society with the help of people who haul it, town employees. All around us here we have a list of exhibits that begin with Native Americans and end up with World War II flyer James Fisher, who was one of the Tuskegee Airmen. So we have a lot of different things to cover tonight. We can only scratch the surface because our history is so rich and deep, but we're going to give it our best shot.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Patricia Randolph. I am on the Martin Luther King Committee, and we are delighted for this opportunity to share African American and Indigenous history on today. We welcome everyone. If you're home and watching, you still have time to come down to the town hall and participate. We are also looking forward to seeing you on Monday at the library when part 2, there'll be vendors, fireside chat, there'll be a panel, there'll be youth activities. It's going to be a wonderful time celebrating Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King. So come join us.
Hi everyone, my name is Erin Roberts. I'm part of the MLK committee. Thank you again for allowing us to put on this event. We definitely want to see you on MLK Day on Monday, January 15th, and please join us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for showing up tonight. This is going to be a very interesting tour of the history of the town of Stoughton. I believe you'll go all the way back to the 1600s, right? Starting.
Yes, well, even before that, if you could, the Native American piece goes back before that, but there's no written history of that, so we do the best we can.
All right. Well, take it away, Dwight.
Greetings, everybody. This was, as I mentioned earlier, is a tour which begins Native American generally to Revolutionary War, Matrix. Then a little bit, Whispering Willows is out of order a little bit, Civil War, and then some of our books. And Howard Hansen has written a commentary in the Town Seal. In this book, Stoughton Sampler, which we republished, has an introduction by me, an introduction by David Allen Lambert, who's town historian, our vice president. Stand up, David. He'll be speaking to us later in the evening. But in the Town Seal, there are 3 buildings. And Howard's commentary points out that one of them is the mill that Isaac Stoughton bought from Isaac Stoughton bought the land from the Neponset Indians in 1631-32. What the actual concept in their mind as to what they were selling and what it meant to be sold is not clear. Because the story is that they kind of hung out in that spot after they'd sold it, and causing disquiet among the Dorchesterites who had bought the land and thought it was their land, and I'm sure Israel Stoughton wanted his mill to run in peace. Well, one thing led to another. They weren't directly related, but eventually the Ponkapog Indian Plantation, Praying Indian Plantation, was formed in 1645? 57. It was sort of the brainchild of John Eliot, apostle to the Indians. John Eliot had translated the Bible into Algonquin. So I know, where's Craig? Craig do you use that? Is that Bible, the translation of that Bible at all helpful in knowing what the words are?
Yes.
Craig is teaching his child Algonquin.
I'm actually teaching other members of the tribe
Would you like to say something to them in Algonquin?
No, not right now. Let's see. Wani Woski Karamu, which means Happy New Year. I'm not just teaching my daughter the language, I'm also teaching other members of the tribe as I am part of the language committee.
And Craig is a descendant, I believe, of the Crowd family who lived on Indian Lane. And there's quite a good exhibit on them in the Canton Historical Society, by the way. If you ever go, they have a wonderful exhibit of stone artifacts because
I actually go all the way back to Chickatawbut, I found out.
Oh, in your lineage to Chickatawbut?
Yeah, he's a direct descendant of the royal family of Massachusetts.
Well, I go back to the hunter-gatherers who walked along the coast before there were any Indian tribes and the ones that came down chasing the mammoths. Now, not many people know that, but I was, believe me. So eventually, John Eliot, one of the cash cows for the colonists was people in England would pay to convert the Indians. And so money came over. It did things like they founded a printing school there was an Indian house at Harvard, which had a printing school, because they were like missionaries and people would fork over money. John Eliot convinced both the citizens of Massachusetts, but also people in England, that it would be appropriate to set up praying Indian communities. I mean, converting the, I won't say heathen, but they were converting them. So the first one was in Natick, the second one was at Ponkapog, which essentially is the whole town of Canton. If you looked at that map, that big green chunk all the way from Ponkapog Pond to York Pond, Glen Echo, was ceded to the Indians forever. We had a program at the Historical Society just a day or three ago, a couple weeks ago, where David Lambert spoke on how they lost their land. I don't know if, David, you'd like to, if off the top of your head, you'd like to comment on the Ponkapog?
I mean, roughly, history tells us it was 6,000 acres, but there's less because of Roger Clapp's purchase in the northeast part of Ponkapog. So in December 1657, Eliot works to acquire 6,000 acres of land, primarily to set up a school to teach agrarian ways. In fact, one of the earliest documents I found at the Mass State Archives refers to one of the Ponkapog. His name was Jumpum, and he is requesting from Edward Rawson a horse to plow his fields. So you go from being hunter-gatherer to now you're teaching them to be farmers and Christianize them. Rawson said no. The interesting thing that Jumpum wrote in the letter, though, in 1665, is that I have other ways to acquire a horse if you don't have me do it this way. So hopefully he had a way of plowing his field. The land itself dwindled down, but it's not all gone, because by the 1830s, I believe, the last of the land we know existed. The land was essentially sold off by the Guardians, and most of the Guardians bought portions of it, people like Jonathan Capon, et cetera. But it was for, say if one of Craig's ancestors was sick, you might be a doctor, gave him medical care. You might be a tailor and make clothes. You might have been a farmer, had excess food, and fed them with apples, whatever the case might be, or cared for an elderly person in your own home. So that accounting to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, every year the Guardian will say, I spent this much, I have to pay these people, I'm going to sell X amount of acres. Surveying in the 18th and 19th century was not the quality it is now. Who knows, maybe it's not even that good now. But there's parcels of land in the original plot of Ponkapog Plantation, which the town of Canton doesn't know who legally owns. They legally own it because it wasn't deeded off correctly. So there is still land. The Ponkapog have land off of Indian Lane. They have land on Glen Echo. I had the honor of being connected with them purely by accident. Dwight, if you don't mind me saying that quick story, you can. The powwow that would occur at the foot of the Blue Hills, about 28 years ago, I went by and someone said, there goes Clinton Wixon, the chief of the Ponkapog. And I said, what? Chief? I said, they're not even organized. Who can be a chief? I know who this guy is. I started researching the Ponkapog when I was 10 years old. I've been doing genealogy since I was a kid. I was too fat to climb trees, so I traced mine in my own home and the native population. I went up to him and I said, you're Clinton Wixon? He goes, yeah. I said, you're chief of the Ponkapog. I said, oh, that means you're Clarence Mantua Wixon's son, and your grandmother was Lydia Tinkham. And I just recited his genealogy back about 280 years off the top of my head. And he looked at me and said, we need to talk. The great community at the Universalist Unitarian Church welcomed the Ponkapog to have their first meetings as a tribal unit in Stoughton. Again, welcoming them back well over 25 years ago. And to just kind of wrap it up, I have two names. David Allen Lambert is one, but to the Massachusetts Ponkapog, they gave me another name after both my parents died. Mine Nuguf Natak, which in Algonquin loosely means past finder, the one who brought their ancestors back to them. And no greater title other than dad or husband or brother could be, and they are truly great friends in the second family. Thanks.
Thank you, David. And while I think of it, David has contributed to our website, which is stoughtonhistory.org. The reason we could know about some of these African-American families is because David in the past had gone to the trouble of studying censuses, studying tax lists, so he had lists of the Martricks, the Dunbars, the Williamses, and other people, and so we had to simply go in and find it. So these mysterious cellar holes that had no names with them except Martrick, suddenly we could flesh out and we could learn more of the stories. And that's really for me, what history is. I think I got into it because I always liked to be outdoors and hunt a lot and hike with dogs, and I'd be at a stone wall or a foundation. You have a lot of time when you're hunting, sitting around waiting for something to happen. And I think, I wonder if I can ever find out who built this stone wall. Because it takes so much work, too, when you think about it, with just oxen and a stone sled to create these miles and miles and miles of walls that dot our landscape. And all the walls that we have in Stoughton or anywhere that seem to be in the middle of the woods give you a sense of how cleared the land used to be. There's a picture over there of even only back in 1927, John Stiles flew over Stoughton and took a picture. And he took one of the crossroads of West Street and Plain Street, and he labels Whispering Willows. But if you just look at how open the fields are then, and that was only, now 100 years ago, whereas 200 years ago, when people still raised most of their own sustenance, they needed soil. They needed to get the rocks out of the soil so grass could grow to feed their cattle. But back to our Native Americans, Ponkapogs were set in their village, but then King Philip's War happened. Metacom was a Massasoit son, and his brother had already died under what he thought were suspicious circumstances. Metacom and the Wampanoags were not ones to be Christianized in any of these praying Indian villages. They weren't having any of that truck. And it struck Philip, it's them or us. They're taking our land. Because each year, they might sell the land. The land was gone. There was a Massachusetts Indian named John Sassamon who had helped Philip. He'd actually served as a translator for Philip in some of the treaties that he'd made, but he also helped John Eliot, I believe, do some of the translations in the Bible. But he was not a favorite with Philip. And one day, John Sassamon, who was a minister in Middleborough, I believe, was found drowned in a hole in the ice. 3 people came forward they told a Massachusetts Indian, they told a Houghton that Philip's men had done it. So these men were put on trial. It's hard to say fair trial, fair or not than Sacco and Vanzetti, but they eventually were convicted and executed. Philip supposedly had been planning to start the war in 2 months, but his men were so angry that they basically started the war then. They raided Swansea, Fatalities started coming. Massacres started happening. In the meantime, the Massachusetts are on our side because they don't care for the Wampanoags. They're would have been our allies. But English were terrified. I mean, people are starting to get, and I've always thought the image of me out there plowing by myself or with my one son, and out of the woods comes a raiding party, and I'm history. And that happened to many towns were burned. The colonists were so terrified, they basically retreated inside of what was 128. Deerfield and all the outer towns, Mendon, were raided, and if not abandoned, it was dangerous to live there. So that worked, in one sense, it worked as a war of terror because it terrified the colonists. But, you know, these white people are sneaky devils and you're mean to us, and by God, you're going to pay the price. So they got together, they had the Great Swamp Fight where they raided the Narragansetts. The Narragansetts hadn't directly allied with Philip, but they were the most powerful tribe around. The rumor was that they were harboring some of Philip's men who'd fled. So in the middle of winter, the Narragansetts had their winter quarters in a swamp and felt safe. But it was a really cold winter. The ice froze, the swamp froze. So this raiding party of New Englanders went down there in this great swamp fight, and it was basically a massacre. And the Narragansetts were I won't say they were ruined, but because they had enough energy to burn the rest of Rhode Island when the whole thing was done. But that was, to some degree, the turning point in the war, where whites had shown, or English had shown they could make a mark on the Indians. Over time, it became apparent that the English were sort of safe inside of 128. And there weren't raiding parties that came inside of 128. No one came to Stoughton because Stoughton didn't exist except at the Canton end where the Indians were. And the Indians found it more and more difficult to grow crops. So they tried growing them at Turner's Falls, where they thought was far enough away. But a guy named Turner went and raided them in the nighttime, killed a lot of them, burned their crops. And on the way back, they came after him. And I believe Turner was killed, and a lot of his party, but that seemed to be one of the final blows, that there was nowhere that the Native Americans could go short of Canada and New Hampshire north where they were going to be safe. They tried to ally with the Mohawks to the west. That didn't work. So over time, they lose the war. Enslavement part 2 happens. The first enslavement was in the Pequot War, which we beat the Pequots in Connecticut. A woman has written a book called Brethren, one of the books I've read, where people began to realize that slaves, servants had value. And if you captured someone in a war, their children, their wives, you could sell them. And they had a value. And that happened again in King Philip's War, where some were executed, some were sent to the Barbados into slavery, whatever. But there's a narrative, too, about how it's not clear how the cultures could have ever coexisted, but it became more a commercial enterprise for Indian captives to be sold. In the meantime, the Ponkapogs were our friend. They had come into the war and had proven themselves to be good allies. Daniel Gookin thought that the war turned when we let the Ponkapogs come and help us, rather than one winter we had them out on Deer Island because we were afraid that nobody trusted the Indians, even if they were, quote, good Indians, but they were brought off the island. Some of the boldest men helped, and Daniel Gookin, who was a supporter of the Indians, attributed that to why we won the war. Bad news was the Indians were enslaved or driven to Canada, except for a few praying Indian villages. Good news was it's safe to come out to Stoughton now. Don't have to worry about those Indians anymore. So that's when the settlement into the lower part of what we call the map of the 25 division picked up, because it was now safer to go out there, and also because these English settlers reproduced at a rate that's rarely been matched in the history of mankind. I mean, Native Americans had a child and the mother breastfed it, and they usually wouldn't have another child for years after that. Not so in English households, where it was usually a child a year until the mother died, and if she died, you could get someone else in the community who comes in and you just continue. Well, that's a lot of population, and the land expands and expands and expands, and that was sort of almost a biological habit reason that whites expanded out and pushed everyone out because they needed space to go, and the younger children went out. And it didn't stop till we got to California, finally. It was that same impulse of growing, 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 and going. But, I mean, there's so much more that can be said about Native Americans and that whole experience, and there are people, doing all sorts of research and bringing the culture back, and I applaud them. But we have other parts of Stoughton history to move on to. Revolutionary War came. Again, not good for the Midwestern Indians, because King George had promised to reserve parts of Ohio in the Midwest for the natives out there, whereas American colonists wanted to expand. We had our ups and downs, but we won the war. We won it with the help of some African-American soldiers, who are the ones we focused on, Sampson Dunbar and Quock Martrick, who it turns out are the people who built the cellar holes that are off of Page Street. I mean, we knew there were these mysterious cellar holes out in the woods associated with Quock Martrick, but it was only in the last year when a woman told us, and this is a white woman, that her ancestor, Joshua Dunbar, came from one of those cellar holes, and she'd like to come and visit. That kind of spurred us to begin to explore it, because I'd heard about it, but I'd never been there. David had already been in touch with a woman named Carol Hector Harris, who was a descendant of Quock Martrick, but she'd never been to the site. It was understood that both families would come and join us, so over time, these mysterious cellar holes became known because we have a will of Quock Martrick, and we could divide the cellar holes up between the one he gave to this daughter and the one he gave to that daughter. And I mean, I've never done much with my own genealogy, but as a Stoughton historian, I tend to adopt families for a short time. So I started to learn a lot about these Martrick families and the Dunbar family and the Campbells and all the people, and a really complicated system of intermarriages and things that went on there. And the two most interesting facts, I would say, is that Louisa Martrick, who was the youngest daughter, married a man from Brockton named Hosea Easton, who became an abolitionist. He decided not to become a metal worker as his parents were, but he was becoming an abolitionist activist, and became a minister in a church in Hartford along with his wife. And I would say he was New England's Frederick Douglass. There's a book called I have the title of it over there, written by George Price, about this activist family, the Eastons. It's hard to believe they were so active. We think of activism as having come in the civil rights movement in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Well, these Eastons were protesting that they couldn't get a pew in the church, in two different churches they went to. So there's a lot more to the story. But Louisa marries Hosea, and they go off to Hartford. What happens then is the Civil War, so we're now at a point where it's been argued that during Jacksonian democracy, where Jackson, the ideas gave sort of lower class whites rights. That's what he did, as opposed to Jefferson. But they tended not to be, and I'm generalizing, not anxious to share those rights with Native Americans or African Americans. So it tended to become a more anti-African American, anti-Native American culture for whatever reason. And slavery took hold in the South. King Cotton came. It became such a great industry to hold slaves. It paid so much. We have a man named Barker Kennedy, who we believe was a freed slave from South Carolina, who ends up marrying one of the Martrick / Jacobs girls and lives out there in the 1865 census. It's hard to find out where he came from, but we have found the records of Henry Barker, who sells a slave and her daughter to Mary Kennedy. If you put the Barker and Kennedy together, you have a sense that maybe sometimes slaves took on the names of their masters, that had something to do with where he came from. Turns out he sells her for $500. $500 was a lot. That was the value of this fecund, fertile female with one child. So, we have discussions now about was the Civil War about slavery. we would not have had a civil war if it weren't for slavery. And the South was so profitable, and they were so committed to it, and they could find the passages in the Bible that justified slavery or serving your master or whatever, because it is in there. I mean, you can justify a lot of things from the Bible if you look into the right crevice. So there was a period of time where it tended to be New Hampshire Democrats like Franklin Pierce and Buchanan, and a lot of apologists in the North made compromises. And you can kind of understand why they did, because who wants a civil war? Civil war would be awful. But it wasn't finally till Lincoln was elected and the South seceded and said, hell no, we won't take it anymore, that the you-know-what hit the fan. And that desk over there, this is the Charles Sumner desk. It's not the desk that he was sitting at in the Senate. You know the story of Charles Sumner had made an anti-slavery speech, and he'd insulted a senator from the South, and that senator's nephew came in as Sumner was sitting on the desk, and he beat Sumner almost to death with his own cane until it broke and he threw it down. But at that point, Charles Sumner was a Free Soil Republican and very pro-northerly cause, and eventually, you know, we fought the war and we won. But there was a period of time, there's a letter from someone named Isaac Williams, who I think in 1820 writes back to Stoughton, asking for someone there to affirm that he is not a slave, because he lives in Washington, D.C., and he's been accused of being an escaped slave, and his friend had to post $150 surety to get him out. So, Civil War happens, and we have quite a few Civil War things here. You know, we have two biographies that of Civil War soldiers. We have this. This was the most common weapon by soldiers on both sides, a .40 caliber rifle that shot. Well, this said 40 on the label of this one, but they tended to be 58s. In any case, it was a gun like this that hit Alfred Waldo in the shoulder at the Battle of Spotsylvania. Alfred Waldo wrote this diary here. He goes to the hospital and he has the good news. He says, they say they can save my arm. And they save it for 3 days, and then the arm gets infected and he's going to die. And his wife, his mother, gets on the train, goes down, and she gets to Washington just in time so he can die. But if you read his diary, which, by the way, we have on sale for $10, he's at all the major battles. Well, he's at Fredericksburg, where his friend Avery Caven from Stoughton gets killed. He's at Antietam in the beginning. He's at Vicksburg, actually. Then he comes back and fights at Knoxville, but then when Grant starts the overland campaign, and Grant understood what they call the bloody arithmetic. They can kill 2 of us, and if we kill 1 of them, we come out ahead because we have a lot more soldiers. I mean, that may be oversimplifying it, but Grant just kept on going, and a lot of people died on our side, and Waldo was one of them. So, I don't know, does anybody have any questions or comments on this Civil War commentary? Because it's, I mean, I got to just make myself stop and move on to the next thing.
Can I mention about Sam Sharp real quick?
Yeah. Yes. And I'll hold up the picture.
So we have a really interesting story. I mean, obviously, enslavement meant many individuals went north. One of those gentlemen is Samuel Sharp, who is from down south. He actually served in the 54th Massachusetts. And if you know where old Wyman Jewelers is, he died on the 2nd floor of that house. But before he died, a great story I stumbled across back when you looked at newspapers on microfilm before they became digital, which are on the Stoughton Public Library website, incidentally, now from 1863 right to 2015. So you might even find something about yourself from years ago.
Let me emphasize
Yeah.
how important that is. Go on to learn, look for newspaper archives. We've never been able to do that before, to put in Samuel Sharp or Quark Martrick or Josephine Crawford and find out where they're mentioned in the newspaper. Now we can.
So what basically happened was Sam, later in his years, decided he was going to go back down to Jim Crow South and go to where he came from, where he ran away from, joined the Union Army and joined the 54th ultimately. They welcomed him with open arms. This is about 1910. So it's very unusual. It's almost a story that I would like to write up and get some more detail, get some photos to pass on to show that there was some healing that went on 50 years afterwards. And even though there were a lot of more bad stories that we hear from down south of the interactions of the African Americans, they welcomed him back like he was a family member. So, but then again, this is 110 years ago. Anyway, Sam Sharp is an amazing story. He's buried at Evergreen Cemetery in the back. He's got the, on his granite gravestone has an emblem of the Grand Army of the Republic. It says 54th Massachusetts. One of Craig's own distant relatives, Jeremiah Bancroft, was also in the 54th, and you'll find his name on the plaque of those who were killed in action from Stoughton during the Civil War.
Thank you. And this Barker Kennedy I mentioned, who married Jacobs and was at Three Swamps, was in the 54th as well. And most of you know the 54th. That's the one we know, Glory and that whole thing. And but Sharp was very popular with his with people in Stoughton in the GAR. He was a charter member, and that's a picture of him waving the flag at the parade. He was called their flag waver. I think the next thing we move on to is Whispering Willows, which I think, question?
Yeah, I want to go back before the Civil War. You mentioned about the Native American concept of sale of land, and I'd heard that before with the famous transaction where Manhattan was sold by the Native Americans to the Southern, whomever. What was the Native American concept of sale of land? It did not mean what the Europeans meant by sale.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I think there was times that they thought even the land was always there to be used. But I mean, I defer to other people, so I'm not sure that's, I just know that, well, there were two things. One, if you needed it, if I needed something from you, I really needed it, and you said, well, sell me your land, and well, I'm doing it because I need it, and it may not be a smart thing to do. The other one early on may have simply been not a sense of knowing what these white people were going to come and build buildings there and get more and more and more. So
I can add just a little bit to that. One of the earliest things from the Mass Archives I stumbled across about 35 years ago is that they weren't deeds like you think of buying Manhattan. 6,000 acres, the Ponkapog numbers were a little limited to needing as much acreage as they had. So they would go to you, like Robert Redmond, and say, we're going to give you a lease for 200 years for land, which 200 years seems kind of silly, but of course you could build a farm, build your house, you have 200 years, and generations can go by. And then all of a sudden, these leases that went on from about 1705 to about 1725-26, they said that even though they had given the Ponkapog their land, 6,000 acres, it wasn't theirs to lease. They were given a guardian, well, they had others, and then by December 22nd, 1726, all this leased land was now deeded, hence Stoughton, Massachusetts.
right, and it was a tricky thing too as to who owned it. Was tribal land, who owned it to sell it. You know, with the crowds who lived here, sell this piece, or it had to go through. So, I mean, it was a complicated business. And, and certainly that's in our roots here because of the Ponkapog plantation. And you look at where the boundaries of it were, and York Pond was, we have a lot of arrowheads. Canton has a better collection than we do, but David has found arrowheads up at West Street. We think in the McNamara Fields, given the fact that that was Trout Brook before it was Ames Pond. It was a very, Trout Brook Meadow was a good place. And to know, even if the first natives who did that were before there was something we could identify as Massachusetts, because it was a progression that went back to long before Chickatawbut of people who were on the land who didn't leave a written record. So that's, we can imagine what happened, but it's hard to know. But we're making a big jump here to Camp Whispering Willows. How many of you here have ever heard of Camp Whispering Willows on West Street? Turns out that a woman named Josephine Crawford, who was an activist in Boston, she was a member of the Gould we have a detailed book on it. She graduated high school, not college. She went to work as a stenographer for Dr. Packard. And then she had a variety of roles for him. He grew to trust her, and there's some story, maybe apocryphal, maybe not, that she gave him some kind of advice that kept him from losing a chunk of his fortune in the crash of whatever. There were a lot of crashes. In any case, he deeded her a big chunk of land on West Street, which includes what we call Packard Manse now, all the way over to what used to be Camp Academy and is now Camp Westwoods. That large chunk of land she owned. But she seemed to have this missionary vision. So from early on, and I think she felt fortunate. She never had any children of her own, but she began boarding 10 African-American girls in the summertime, and then it grew, and it grew, and it grew. And if you see the literature we have over there, at one point it may have been as high as 150. And, you know, some moving stories have come out of that. One was the fire that killed Anna Slade, that basically brought an end to the year-round camp. It was a terrible fire, and but a positive part of that story is I had a lady come to the Historical Society, a black woman about my age, maybe a little older. She said, I was one of the children there on the roof out back when that burned. She said, I remember being in the flames. I don't remember how I got down. She said, all I remember is some nice Stoughton fireman put his coat around me. No, the reason her name is Loretta. The reason she was there was she and her sister were orphans, no one else in the world, and they'd been abused in the foster home they were before, so they'd been sent to Whispering Willows. And they said it wasn't perfect, but was a lot better than where they'd been. But then the fire came, they had to go back. And she didn't make a point of it, but it struck me ever since then, to be a person in life, an orphan, you have nothing, foster homes maybe, and the place you've found that you kind of like goes poof, and you got to go back to this abusive home. You know, that's about as bad a situation as I can imagine, but life, somehow she stuck with it. She met a guy. I think she moved to Georgia. She met a gentleman who turned out to be an up-and-comer. He became a professor of architecture at LSU. They raised a very successful family, had a good life. The gentleman with her in the picture was her nephew, who now lives in Bridgewater, I believe. But I told her, I said, it's an honor for me to be standing here beside you, having gone what you went through, being one of the kids on that back porch where you were then, to have come this far and then come to visit us. I mean, it's one of those sort of feel-good history stories. It was like being able to take the women this summer who'd never been to the cemetery that their ancestors were buried in, to just take it in the heart, just take them out there, and there's a picture of her saying a prayer there to see the place where your great-great-grandfather died. Granted, it's an unmarked grave, but there's supposed to be 50 bodies there. So sometimes, I mean, there's a difference between what Josephine Crawford did, where she earnestly tried to help people year after year after year. I'm not claiming I do that. I enjoy history, and sometimes in the course of doing history, I can help people out. That's the difference. When Josephine got older, it was harder for her to run it, so there's another man named Willis Pitts. Any of you know Willis Pitts? He taught drama at Stoughton High School for 10 years, and he was African American, and there's a book up there on his family. They met Josephine Crawford, and they decided to help her. And Richard Fitzpatrick, where are you? You remember Willis Pitts, right? And I think you remembered that they took over Whispering Willows and ran it as a summer camp for 10, 12 years after Josephine Crawford died. And again, another story of well, they didn't come from a humble background, but he really contributed a lot to Stoughton, between being the drama teacher there, but just what he did at Whispering Willows to make it work for a while. So there's a lot of information on that. If you get our newsletter, I've been talking about it a lot, and we have more to add now because we found the front page picture. Since we can look in the newspaper, I could Google, or I could index in Whispering Willows, and we find the front page story that has a group of, it looks like 25 African American women at the place, and just adds depth to what we know about it. But that brings us to World War II, which many of you don't know that Stoughton had its own Tuskegee Airmen. Jim Fisher, who I had the honor of meeting about 12 years ago, he grew up in the Glen Echo area. He was partly Native American, partly African American, and for whatever reason he chose to go by Native American, but you don't always get to make those choices. He had TB when he was 4, was sent off to a home in Rutland. There's a TB sanitarium in Rutland that David said your grandfather went there. Came back after 4 years, survived, went to Stoughton High School, had the same principal Joe DeVito did. He was a so-so student, and the principal of Stoughton at the time was Howie Randall. And he said to Jim Fisher, he said, you got to pass these 3 courses to graduate. He said, tell you what, I will, and Jim Fisher liked to hunt. He said, I'll let you borrow this shotgun if you promise to go to class and pass. Well, he did, and Howie Randall eventually gave him the shotgun. One thing, but Jim Fisher had also taken up flying. So for the Tuskegee Airmen, when they formed that unit, which I think was a Lawrence Fishburne, you saw the movie he was in on the Red Tail. It was a black, large regiment of flyers whose job was to protect bomber pilots. That was finally their job. They would play fighter, they were fighter escorts to the bombers when they went over. And in mixed case, but they in general, they did a damn good job. And there were a lot of things in this. There's one picture of, if this is still moving for us here, his niece put together this piece on her uncle. There's Jim Fisher, long before I knew him. And there he is, right there. One of his adventures was to, he lost this, it was something where he had to fly like 400 miles with his plane barely under control and crash landed, but they saved him. And he came out, and the niece is honest enough to admit, she said that's where his bitterness began. She said, my uncle was a bitter man because he thought he could get a job as an airline pilot, a decent occupation. He said, but as soon as he went for his interviews, So we ended up, for a while, crop dusting, giving lessons at the Brockton Airport, and pulling banners, which he didn't buy. And eventually went to California, but it sounds like from his niece's account that he just got more and more bitter. Eventually he came back, and his sister convinced him to get veteran services. So he'd never gotten veteran services before. Back in Stoughton, I forget the order of things, but the Historical Society found out about him. We gave him an award. He was elected to the High School Academic Hall of Fame. And then eventually, under George Bush, they decided they're going to honor the Tuskegee Airmen. And he said he's not going to go. Can't go. He's sick. He's tired. His niece says, "You're not that sick, and you're going because I'm taking you." So she took him to Washington. We have a picture of him, eating the dinners in front of the gold medal and George Bush saluting them, whatever. So, and I believe he passed away 10 years ago. But as a Tuskegee Airman, he is, he's the one soldier of color that I know of his experience in World War II that stands out. See, there are many other stories, but if we don't know what they are, we can't tell you. We can tell you about the 2 men who wrote their diary for the Civil War because we have their diary. We know Jim Fisher because he was a Tuskegee Airman and things came of that. So in history, we can't get ourselves, we get the whole story, but we get the stories that we can. When you see these stories around, we try and piece together what we can from them. And I want to thank my crew who come in, our crew. Dave Lambert is vice president, but Richard Fitzpatrick and Dan Mark and Ken Beauregard, who else is out here that I'm missing? Come into the society every week, and we sit and we try and organize the stuff we have, but we get distracted by it, and it tends to pile up, and we'll let the next generation worry about that because we're accumulating quite a pile of good stuff. So I believe, given the progression where we went all the way from Native Americans to World War II and this gentleman, I think that's the tour that I had in mind. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions on anything we've said, but you'd be like a good, I taught school for 34 years, so sometimes you ask for questions and nobody says anything, but Cynthia would ask a question.
I don't have a question, I have a comment. Thank you for what you've been able to present. I know just a little bit of Stoughton history. I've only lived in Stoughton for 75 years. But I'm also on the Memorial Square Committee, and a couple of years ago we dedicated a square to Alfred J. Silver Jr. And he served with the colored troops, which is what I believe they were called, during World War II. His family has a picture of him with his fellow soldiers receiving a medal from General Eisenhower, which is, Eisenhower was from Texas, so it's kind of South meets the former enslaved. Mr. Silver was married to Jeanette Silver. I don't know her maiden name, but she was African/indigenous, and her children hold offices in some indigenous tribes. One recently passed away, and they appear at powwows. They have a drum circle. So they lived up off of Turnpike Street. Then some family members lived on 10th Street. Growing up, there's always been people of color in Stoughton. People seem to think we're being invaded or something. But growing up, I went to school with children of color. The fact is, though, that their housing was restricted. You mentioned Glen Echo and that part of Turnpike Street. There was also part of Sumner Gardens where realtors made sure that when people of color wanted to move to Stoughton, they were only shown certain neighborhoods. And this happened up until the mid-60s when laws were passed and they started actually enforcing them. But I want folks to know that we've had an indigenous population and an African American population, and I can go back, but my family goes back 5 generations. So these folks aren't new to Stoughton. They've just been here, and folks have tried to keep them in the woods, I guess you'd say. But hopefully those things are changing.
Thank you, and I'd love to get the picture of Mr. Silver and his getting the award from Eisenhower. It does remind me, though, Joe DeVito and Jean have now gone into assisted housing, and they're up off of Central, and I know that there's a Silva up there who's also a World War II veteran. As I talked to the daughter today, so that's just the name Silver triggered that. I hear what you said, Cynthia, but I've heard Denise Peterson and Stu Sterling look in their yearbook, and there was one black girl, and they knew her name.
Renee Lombray.
Yes.
But there were 2 others. There was a Catherine and Wayne Vega, and someone that people thought was black, George Green, but George Green was indigenous. He was dark-skinned, so people weren't so aware that there were. People only thought indigenous people lived in the West, and they rode around with eagle feathers on horses and shot at the U.S. cavalry, and we fired back. But George Green was very. The thing about these folks is they were forced to be silent. Renee was a cheerleader. Renee was a bubbling personality, a gorgeous person. But the other people I mentioned, they kept trying to fade in. I don't think I could tell you what Wayne Vega's sounded like. And he was in my home room. And it it's my fault that I never engaged him in any kind of conversation. He wore a suit every single day. He was a slight man. Now, Kathy was a big girl, and I was a big girl. So we had a kind of a big girl palship, especially during phys ed classes, because those ugly outfits we had to wear. And when the teacher would tell Kathy and I to do, 20 jumping jacks, we just looked at each other and rolled our eyes. I don't know what happened to her, and I don't know what happened to George Green. I've never seen a person of color at any of our reunions.
Well, and to jump, and probably to, I don't know if I'm contradicting what you said, and I'm no way being critical, but in this class, there was one, I go to my grandchildren's classes at the Daw School, it's a very different picture. We are talking the United Nations. I mean, you have people of every color there, so it's true we may have had some people of color in Stoughton, but now it's really across the board. People are embedded in the community, and I really like seeing that. So some people think the world's going to hell because that's happening. I think, yeah, it's happening, but I think it's a good thing.
Sometime during my career as a teacher, some of my classes were a quarter children of color, and then about a third of children who were new arrivals from different nations. But I offered a scholarship for about 30 years, and I always presented it myself. So I would be at the assemblies and be at graduation from, I'd say, the 80s down to the pandemic. And it is a whole new world, and it's such a better world. I can remember graduating from Stoughton High School in 1965, and certain people, when they walked across the stage to get their diploma, were booed or there was complete silence. And it wasn't because of color, because there were so few people of color. But you go now, everyone is applauded. Transgender seniors are applauded. Children of color, children from, as you said, everywhere in the world. You have such hope for the world when you see these young people, and you are as old as I am, and remember how good things are now. Granted, they could be a lot better, but they're so much better than they were.
And I will bring this to a close because it reminds me of a story that Jim Fisher told me when he came to us. He saw Joe DeVito and Evelyn, and he talked to them, and he said, when I walked down the aisle at the Stoughton High School graduation, he said, your sister, Mary DeVito, walked beside me. He said, when a lot of others wouldn't. So it was a good moment there, and I thank you all for listening and take the tour and whatever. And do any of you, would you like to close it off?
We didn't have the opportunity to applaud your historical group. You named them and pointed them out, but can you say their names again?
For Ken Bjerregaard, Dan Mark, Richard Fitzpatrick, who are the ones that are...
Can they stand so we'll know who
Or can it come to the front, because you're doing great work and you're collecting all of this data, pictures, articles, artifacts.
And we have Dave Martin, who actually lives in Sharon and is in more of the Sharon Historical Society. He's given us some really good information. But Richard Fitzpatrick is there. Ken Bjerregaard is there. Dan Mark, I think, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I wanted to point out some people that were members of the Stoughton Equal Opportunity Committee. Dr. Betty Sabri, can you please stand? She helped to organize. We have Dr. Patricia. Yes, can you please stand? And she's also on the 300th committee. On the MLK Planning Committee, we have Aaron Roberts in the back, if you could stand, on the MLK Planning Committee. And If I'm missing anyone, I can't see anyone, but I would like to thank Mrs. Walsh for always sharing your historical knowledge. So thank you, David. Thank you, Dwight. And this is, and our volunteers. Dr. Patricia, can you please?
I suppose we should also mention, I believe, the first select woman of color in Stoughton. So
That's
she
right.
probably deserves it.
Let's give Deborah Roberts a hand. That's right, that's right. We do want to thank the students from Stoughton High School and O'Donnell Middle School. Could you stand? And this is only 4. We have 5 or 6 other students coming on Monday. And so the principals and Dr. Beata have been so supportive, and we're thankful to him. And it's great to partner with the schools in Stoughton.
And I would thank the DPW and Arthur for moving our heavy stuff here. Because once Cynthia pointed out that we weren't handicapped accessible, here's why we're here, but they helped us get our stuff here. So it worked out. So.
Thank you, everyone. Please continue the tour. It's a lot of really nice information. And also, have the refreshments. Thank you so very much, and good evening.